I've got some troubling news about England's royal family.
Princess Anne refused to let the state banquet begin, not for the anthem, not for the toast. She stood at the head of the receiving line and simply didn't move, because the seating chart in her hand didn't match the one she'd approved 3 weeks earlier, and the only name that had quietly disappeared from the top table was Catherine's. Nobody in that hall understood, at first, why an 80-year-old woman in full ceremonial dress was standing perfectly still in front of 400 guests, holding up a dinner. They would understand within the hour. This one starts small, a printed card, a single name moved 3 tables back, and it ends with a king doing something he has never once done in 30 years of marriage. Stay with me, because the real story isn't the seating chart. It's who changed it and what she thought nobody would ever be able to prove. If you're the kind of viewer who likes it when a quiet piece of paper turns out to be the whole weapon, hit subscribe here at theroyalpulse.now. Let's get into it. 3 weeks earlier state banquets don't happen by accident. Every seat, every name card, every glass placement is decided weeks in advance by a small office inside the household that exists for exactly this purpose. Protocol, precedence, who sits beside whom and why, all of it mapped out on paper long before a single guest arrives. 3 weeks before the banquet honoring a visiting head of state, that seating chart had gone through its final approval. Anne, who has overseen ceremonial seating at state functions for longer than most of the staff in that office have been alive, had signed off on it personally. Catherine was seated at the top table, 4 seats from the king, in the position her role as Princess of Wales called for. It wasn't a special favor. It was simply where protocol placed her. Camilla had seen the chart too, at the same meeting, and hadn't objected to a single placement. That detail matters because it means whatever happened afterward wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a decision made after the fact by someone who already knew exactly what the approved version looked like. What Camilla did with the extra 10 days, in the 10 days between that approval meeting and the banquet itself, something happened inside the printing office that nobody thought to question at the time. A revised chart arrived at the print room with instructions to produce the final place cards. Nothing about the request looked unusual. Revisions happen constantly in the run-up to an event like this. Guests get added or dropped, dietary notes get updated, table numbers shift by 1 or 2 seats as RSVP settle. The printing staff had no reason to compare the new instructions against the version Anne had signed off on weeks earlier. That comparison simply wasn't part of their job. The new chart moved exactly 1 name. Catherine's place card, instead of sitting at the top table near the king, had been reassigned to a table near the back of the hall, still within view of the cameras stationed for the broadcast, but far enough removed that she would not appear in a single official photograph taken that evening. Every other name on the chart stayed exactly where it had been. The instruction had come, according to the printing office's own records, from Camilla's private secretary, a careful, soft-spoken man named Mr. Pembridge, who had worked for her for nearly 6 years and had never once, in that time, given anyone reason to question a request that came through his office. What William noticed first, William didn't find out through any grand discovery. He found out because he happened to walk past the printed table plan mounted outside the banquet hall 2 hours before the doors opened, the way guests would later that evening, checking his own table number out of habit more than necessity. His name was where it should have been. Catherine's wasn't. He stood there a moment longer than he needed to, reading the chart twice, assuming at first that he'd simply misread it. He hadn't. Her name sat at a table numbered in the low 20s near a side entrance, 3 full tables and an aisle away from where he stood. He found Catherine in her dressing room less than 10 minutes later, already in the gown she'd chosen for the evening, and he didn't lead with alarm. He simply asked carefully whether anyone had told her about a change to the seating. She hadn't heard anything. Nobody had told her because nobody was supposed to have to. The chart had been approved weeks earlier, and as far as either of them knew, it hadn't changed since. Anne's copy, William, didn't go to his father first. He went to his aunt, because Anne was the one person in the building who would have the original, signed-off version of the chart in her own possession, not a copy that could have been quietly altered somewhere downstream. She kept her own file for exactly this reason. A habit from decades of ceremonial planning, the understanding that paper moving through several hands before an event tends to drift, sometimes by accident and sometimes not. She pulled her copy without needing to be asked twice, laid it flat on the desk in her study, and set the printed chart from outside the hall beside it. The two didn't match. 1 name, 1 seat, moved a significant distance in a large room. Everything else identical, down to the smallest placement. Anne didn't react the way William expected. She didn't look surprised. She looked, if anything, like a woman confirming something she'd already suspected, without quite letting herself say it out loud. "This isn't the first small thing I've noticed," she told him. "It's only the first one that left paper behind." What Anne had been watching, she told William briefly, about a pattern she'd started tracking herself over the past year without ever raising it formally. Small adjustments to guest lists, photography schedules, and joint appearances that always seemed to shift by inches rather than obvious moves in the same direction. Catherine's position in a group photograph moved slightly further from center. A joint engagement quietly split into two separate visits scheduled on different days. Nothing dramatic enough on its own to raise as a complaint. Anne had noticed the accumulation of it, the way someone notices a floor tilting slowly enough that no single step feels wrong, but the room still ends up somewhere different than where it started. She hadn't said anything before now because she'd never had anything concrete enough to point to. A moved place card with two conflicting versions of the same document sitting side by side was concrete. "I'm not going to make an accusation I can't prove," she told William, "but I am not going to let this happen quietly either. If it happens tonight, in that hall, it happens in front of everyone, and it stops the moment I decide it stops." The warning nobody gave Camilla, there was still time, technically, to fix the seating before the doors opened, to quietly move Catherine's card back, correct the printing error, let the evening proceed as originally planned, with nobody outside a small circle ever knowing anything had gone differently. Anne chose not to do that. She told William plainly why. If the chart was corrected quietly, whoever had made the change would simply understand that the correction had been noticed and would learn to be more careful the next time. Smaller, harder to trace, buried under a more convincing excuse. Anne had watched this exact family manage difficult things quietly for most of her life, and she had come to believe, slowly and without much satisfaction in the conclusion, that quiet handling mostly succeeded in teaching people how to do the same thing again more carefully. She told William she intended to let the evening proceed exactly as printed, and to handle it herself in the room at the moment it mattered most. William didn't argue with her. He told Catherine only that whatever happened tonight, she should trust that it would be handled, and that she shouldn't feel obligated to solve it herself in the middle of a state dinner. The receiving line state banquets begin with a receiving line, guests arriving in careful order, the family positioned to greet the visiting head of state and the accompanying delegation before anyone moves through to the hall itself. It's a formal, unhurried procedure, choreographed down to the minute. Camilla arrived at her position beside Charles looking, by every account from staff present, entirely at ease. She'd seen the finalized table plan mounted outside the hall on her way in, the same way every guest had, and by every indication she believed it reflected exactly what she'd arranged. Anne was positioned near the head of the line, holding a folder rather than simply standing empty-handed the way ceremonial protocol usually allows. When the visiting delegation had been greeted and the moment came for the receiving line to proceed toward the hall, she didn't move. It took a few seconds for anyone nearby to register that something had stopped. A receiving line doesn't halt on its own. Every person in it is trained to keep the procedure moving smoothly, and the pause registered first as confusion rather than alarm. Charles glanced back. Camilla, a step ahead of her sister-in-law, turned as well, her expression shifting from polite composure into something more careful. Anne held up the folder. "Before anyone proceeds," she said, her voice pitched to carry without needing to be raised, "I'd like the seating confirmed against the version I approved 3 weeks ago, because the chart posted outside this hall does not match it. What happened in front of the delegation, there is a specific kind of silence that settles over a room full of people who all understand simultaneously that something has gone wrong, but don't yet know what." That silence spread through the receiving line in the seconds after Anne spoke. Charles asked her, quietly, what she meant. Anne didn't lower her voice to answer him, which several staff members present would later describe as a deliberate choice rather than an oversight. She explained plainly that the chart she'd signed off on 3 weeks earlier placed Princess Catherine at the top table, and that the chart currently posted outside the hall placed her 3 tables back, near a side entrance, with every other name on the document otherwise unchanged. She said she'd like an explanation for the discrepancy before the delegation proceeded any further, because she wasn't willing to seat a member of this family somewhere her role in this country didn't call for, based on a change nobody had approved. Camilla's response, according to 3 separate accounts from people close enough to hear it, was immediate and dismissive. She said printing errors happened constantly with events this size, that it was almost certainly a clerical mistake somewhere in the process, and that surely this could be sorted quietly rather than debated in front of a visiting delegation. Anne didn't move. It can be sorted immediately, she said, by seating Princess Catherine where the approved chart places her. That takes considerably less time than this conversation already has. The correction Charles, visibly uncomfortable with the growing audience but unwilling to let the moment stretch any further, gave the instruction himself. Catherine's place was corrected on the spot. Her card physically moved back to the top table by a member of staff while the receiving line waited. An unmistakable, visible correction happening in real time in front of guests who had already begun to notice that something unusual was taking place. It was on its own a relatively small resolution. A card moved back to where it should have been. The banquet proceeded only a few minutes behind schedule. But the moment didn't end there, because Anne wasn't finished. She told Charles, still within earshot of enough people that the words would inevitably travel, that she intended to keep both versions of the chart, the one she'd approved and the one that had been printed instead, because she wanted a clear record of exactly how the discrepancy had occurred before anyone characterized it afterward as an innocent mistake. Camilla's composure, which had held through the initial exchange, visibly faltered at that. It was a small thing, a tightening around her eyes, a pause half a second too long before she spoke again, but it was the first genuine crack anyone in that line had seen in her all evening. What the printing office confirmed, the banquet proceeded. Toasts were given. The evening, by any outward measure, recovered its intended shape. But the question of how the chart had actually changed didn't disappear once the guests moved on to dinner. It simply moved quietly into a different room. William asked the printing office directly the following morning for the paper trail behind the revised chart. It didn't take long to produce. The instruction to move Catherine's seating had come through in writing 10 days earlier from Camilla's private office, specifically routed through Mr. Pembridge, along with a note instructing the printing staff to treat the revision as final and not to circulate it back through Anne's ceremonial office for a second approval, since, according to the note, the change had already been discussed and agreed. That last detail was the one that mattered most. It hadn't been discussed. Anne's own signed copy, dated weeks earlier, proved that conclusively. Someone had deliberately instructed the printing office to skip the usual second approval, specifically to avoid the one person in the building most likely to notice. The private conversation Charles spoke with Camilla alone that afternoon, without advisors present, in a conversation that several staff members would later describe secondhand, though none claimed to have heard it directly. What's known with more certainty is what came immediately after. Camilla didn't deny having authorized the change once the paper trail was laid in front of her. Denial at that point wasn't a credible option. Her explanation, when she gave one, echoed something Anne had suspected all along without being able to prove it. A growing private frustration at watching the public's attention shift banquet after banquet, engagement after engagement toward the younger couple, and a belief that small, deniable adjustments to visibility might quietly correct what she felt was an imbalance nobody in the family seemed willing to discuss openly. She hadn't intended it as public humiliation, she told Charles. She'd intended it as something smaller and, in her mind, more defensible. A few feet of distance from the cameras, nothing anyone could reasonably call an insult if it were ever noticed at all. Charles didn't accept that framing, and he told her so directly. Whatever the intention had been, the outcome was a deliberate, undisclosed change to his daughter-in-law's place at a state occasion, carried out specifically to avoid detection by the one person whose job it was to catch exactly this kind of thing. What Charles did, unlike the quiet, informal handling this family has favored for most of its history, Charles chose not to let this settle back into silence. He didn't strip any titles. He didn't issue a public statement naming what had happened. Some things, he told William afterward, were better handled without turning them into a spectacle the press could pick apart for months. But he made 2 decisions that were felt clearly inside the household, even without ever being formally announced. The first was procedural. Going forward, any change to a ceremonial seating chart, once signed off by Anne's office, would require her direct written reapproval before printing, a rule that had technically existed before but had clearly not been enforced strictly enough to prevent exactly this. The second was more personal. He quietly reduced the number of joint public engagements he and Camilla would share with William and Catherine over the following months, not as punishment exactly, but as a deliberate removal of the exact situations where this kind of quiet maneuvering had apparently felt tempting in the first place. Mr. Pembridge, for his part, remained in his position. He had, after all, only carried out an instruction he'd been given directly without the standing to refuse it. But it was made clear to him, in a conversation with Charles's own private secretary, that any future instruction touching ceremonial protocol would need to be verified independently before being acted on, a small, permanent adjustment to how much authority his office carried unquestioned. What Anne said afterward, Anne never spoke publicly about what happened in that receiving line, and the palace's official account of the evening, released the following day, mentioned nothing beyond a brief generic note about a minor printing discrepancy corrected before the banquet began. Privately, she told William something that stayed with him longer than the confrontation itself. "I didn't stop that line because of a seating chart," she said. "I stopped it because I've spent most of my life watching this family solve its discomfort by making someone smaller quietly, a little at a time, until nobody could point to the moment it actually happened. I wasn't going to watch it happen to her, too, not while I still have the standing to stop it." Catherine, when she heard this secondhand, didn't ask for anything further to be done. She told William she didn't need an apology delivered publicly or a statement, or any acknowledgement beyond what had already happened in that hall in front of everyone who needed to see it. The correction itself, made visibly, in real time, had already said everything that needed saying. What changed in the weeks that followed? Nothing about the family's public rhythm looked dramatically different. Camilla continued her official duties without visible disruption. Charles and Catherine appeared together at engagements as they always had. On the surface, very little seemed to have shifted at all. But inside the household, something had. Ceremonial staff, without ever being told explicitly why, began double-checking seating charts against signed originals as a matter of routine, not exception. Anne's office, which had operated for years with a certain informal trust extended to other departments, became noticeably less willing to accept last-minute revisions without a second signature. And Camilla, for her part, never attempted anything resembling it again, not because she'd been forced to promise as much, but because she understood clearly exactly what it had cost her the one time it had been caught. A seat moved 3 tables back had, in the end, moved her own standing considerably further than that. The chart itself, both versions, the approved one and the altered one, stayed in Anne's private files, unused, unreferenced, kept the way she kept most things she didn't fully trust to be forgotten cleanly. Not as a weapon, just as a record in case the family's memory ever proved shorter than the papers.